President Moon Jae-in's administration has taken a range of measures to help the self-employed as part of building what it calls an inclusive nation. And it announced on Thursday that by 2022, 30 commercial districts in old downtown areas where self-employed businesses are concentrated will be transformed into new composite spaces where people can enjoy shopping and culture. The specific locations of these 30 areas have not been decided yet, but some of them are in the cities of Daegu and Suwon. Speaking to reporters on Thursday in Seoul, the Minister of SMEs and Startups Hong Jong-ak said the measure includes supporting traditional markets by improving their facilities, for instance, or adding more space for parking. Another main issue is revitalizing local economies. The Ministry of SMEs says it will issue more gift certificates that can be used in traditional markets or small and mid-sized businesses. One example is the Onnuri gift certificate. For that one in particular, the ministry aims to issue around $8.9 billion worth of them by 2022, and it will encourage public institutions to buy more of them. These measures are also about creating a stronger social safety net. The government will review whether it can make it easier for the self-employed to get employment insurance. Plus, for the self-employed who are worried about their overdue debts, the government plans to increase the percentage of people applicable for debt forgiveness, depending on their financial condition. And for people who want to start their own businesses, the government aims to provide vocational training for 20,000 people by 2022. 고르니, Arirang News.
In other news, despite pressure from President Trump, the Fed has raised rates again. It's the fourth hike this year, but it forecast fewer rate hikes for next year. Our Kim Yo-sun reports.
As markets had expected, the U.S. Federal Reserve raised its benchmark interest rate by a quarter point on Wednesday. Following the Federal Open Market Committee meeting, the Fed said the target range for its benchmark funds rate now stands between 2.25 to 2.5%. This is the fourth hike this year and the ninth since the Fed began normalizing rates in December of 2015. It explained that the labor market continued to strengthen and economic activities have expanded.
You have growth well above trend, you've got unemployment dropping, you've got inflation moving up to 2%, and we also have a positive forecast, as I mentioned, and in that context, we think this move was appropriate for what is a very healthy economy.
The Fed, meanwhile, projected there will be 2 rate hikes next year, a reduction from what it forecast in September. The increase came despite President Trump's tweet earlier this week, in which he called it, quote, incredible the Fed was considering raising rates. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Now, in case the Fed's rate hike causes any financial volatility here, South Korea's economic policymakers say they're going to be thoroughly prepared. At an emergency meeting Thursday, officials from the Finance Ministry and the Bank of Korea examined the effect the Fed's rate decision might have on global markets, as well as on domestic financial and foreign exchange markets. The Fed's decision means U.S. rates are now 75 basis points higher than Korea's. But the first Vice Minister of Economy and Finance, Lee Ho-sung, pointed to South Korea's strong fundamentals and said the financial market can withstand a gap of that size. He added, though, that the government will carry out a contingency plan if it sees signs of financial volatility or capital outflow. Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol told reporters that the Fed's rate hike was widely expected, but that he will closely monitor external risks. The growing interest in Korean culture worldwide, from the food and the history to the films and the music, means more foreign visitors are coming here to experience Korea and its unique culture firsthand. So Eun-kyung tells us more.
Nervous yet excited, 7 visitors from 4 different countries have gathered to learn their first Korean words and phrases together. But this is no ordinary Korean class. The phrases they learn are primarily focused on shopping because in just a moment, they'll be buying ingredients using their newly acquired language skills. Armed with 5 sentences they've just learned, they hit the crowded market, put the phrases into practice. Let's see how they do.
얼마예요?
1,000원씩. 1,000원.
참깨 있어요?
참깨.
Feeling anxious, this tourist from Singapore successfully buys some sesame seeds.
Learning Korean was challenging but fun. and we managed to buy the ingredients in the market.
Armed with the ingredients they bought themselves, the tourists now try their hand at making some popular Korean dishes. On the menu is jeon, a traditional Korean pancake. Learning how many Koreans enjoy jeon with makgeolli, Korea's traditional rice wine, the visitors get to learn the recipes while observing Korea's vibrant food culture. Also on the menu is kimbap, Korea's famous seaweed rice roll, and tteokbokki, rice cakes covered in a fiery chili paste. No visit to Korea is complete without trying two of the country's most popular street foods. And bulgogi, marinated slices of beef, is proving a hit with the visitors.
It tastes really good, and I think it was fun to actually experience how it's prepared.
We have 1.5 times more people applying for our program compared to last year. With more people showing interest in Korean food, people of all ages from various countries are taking part in the program.
Food is not the only aspect of Korean culture that foreign visitors want to experience. With the exploding global impact of K-pop, more tourists are applying for K-pop dance classes, learning how to shake their hips like their favorite idol stars.
As social media enables people to have easier access to information regarding any country, they easily get information about our tour items which they can try in person.
The expert added that since South Korea is geographically small in terms of sightseeing tours, it needs to further develop seasonal and local experience tours such as the one enjoyed by these tourists. 차원경, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
Washington's point man on North Korea, Stephen Biegun, arrived here in Seoul on Wednesday to hold talks with his South Korean counterpart. But upon his arrival, he surprised many by announcing that the US would be re-evaluating their policies to support aid efforts into North Korea. Lee Ji-won reports.
Moments after his arrival Wednesday at the airport, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea Stephen Biegun said the U.S. will review its policies on humanitarian assistance for North Korea so that aid can be delivered without hurting the sanctions' effectiveness.
Toward that end, upon my return to Washington, D.C. next week, I've been directed by Secretary of State Pompeo to review United States policy on humanitarian assistance provided to the DPRK by private and religious American organizations.
Biegun said that humanitarian aid organizations operating on the North are concerned that the strict enforcement of sanctions has sometimes gotten in the way of delivering humanitarian aid to the North Korean people. He added that he will be sitting down with those groups early next year to discuss how to better ensure that aid is delivered, especially this winter. This would include possibly allowing American citizens to travel to the North to help with delivery and to monitor aid programs. The surprise announcement comes as Biegun arrived for a 4-day visit to Seoul to hold a series of talks with the Special Representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs Lee Do-hun. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
For more on that story, we have with us Dr. James Kim, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So if we just recap briefly, Biegun has revealed that after his trip to Seoul this week, he will help review Washington's policies towards humanitarian assistance to North Korea, as he says some humanitarian organizations have expressed concerns that the sanctions on North Korea have occasionally, if we quote him, impeded aid into North Korea. Now, I understand that humanitarian aid is meant to be exempt from international sanctions on Korea. So, I mean, what have the problems been so far?
Right, so humanitarian assistance in and of themselves is not a problem. But on the disbursement of those aids, you necessarily require people on the ground. So there are travel restrictions in place for that. And there's a review process that the person needs to go through and get validated by the State Department in order to be on the ground in North Korea. And then the second issue has to do with fund transfers within the country while those aid workers are there, which is again subject to potential sanctions violations. So again, on both grounds, you would have to get on a case-by-case basis a review by the State Department to get approval and validation for that work. But it's been a little bit more difficult than in the past in order to get that approval. And so part of what this announcement suggests is to try to streamline that process in order to make it easier for the aid workers to go in the country and do what they need to do.
So I understand as well there's been, one of the reasons this has been so difficult is because also there was, apart from the sanctions, there was a travel ban that was issued on all US citizens, which makes it very hard for them to be allowed into North Korea. He seemed to imply that this process will also be reviewed when he returns to Washington. But he also seemed to imply that it was sparked by the case of a US citizen who was detained in Pyongyang for a month back in October for illegally entering North Korea. I mean, what do we know about this incident? And what is the current situation with the travel ban for Americans?
So this particular individual who's from Louisiana, I believe his name was Lawrence Byron, if I'm not mistaken, tried two ways to get into North Korea. Once through the demilitarized zone from South Korea, and he was detained for trying to do that. Obviously was unsuccessful. He tried to go in through China this time and was detained by the North Koreans, and he claimed that he was sent by the American government to try to get the North Koreans to engage in a peaceful dialogue. Again, it's not clear what the intention was there, but he was detained for about a month. And he was expeditiously taken out of the country with the assistance of the Swedish embassy. So this, in many ways, is a different kind of scenario than what we've seen with someone like Otto Warmbier, who was detained and then, subsequently had some medical problems while he was being detained in North Korea for a very prolonged time. So I think that the U.S. is looking at this as a goodwill gesture on part of North Koreans, and that the State Department is thinking twice about whether or not the travel ban is really necessary if the North Koreans are willing to cooperate in this way.
As you said, the American citizen was returned very quickly, considering past experiences that we've had with North Korea and American detainees. Biegun actually called it expeditious and with great discretion and sensitivity through diplomatic channels. He also said this step gives us greater confidence about the safety and security of Americans traveling to North Korea. So this is quite encouraging that it seems that North Korea is also making goodwill gestures to the US, and the US now seems to be taking some sort of reciprocal step as well.
Right, but we have to understand that this was right before the talks were called off in mid to late November. So this was when still things were going very smoothly. We're at the current situation that we're in when the North Korean Choi Sun-hee counterpart Kim Jong-un decided not to show up in that high-level meeting late November as it was scheduled, and we're kind of in a sort of in a limbo at the moment, and the talks are somewhat stalling. If not, it's on hold. I think that's the correct characterization from the State Department, that State Department is waiting for the North Koreans to tell them when the next talk will be, and if so, where. Again, this is all of this development happened before that incident. So to some extent, I would take it with a grain of salt and say, yeah, these were good developments, but I wouldn't overestimate what these developments mean for the talks moving ahead and current situation that we're in.
I mean, that was going to be the next question, because the humanitarian situation in North Korea is very dire. So having these kind of humanitarian aid efforts would be beneficial to North Korea. So wouldn't they take this sign that the US is reviewing their policies to allow more humanitarian aid to come in? Wouldn't that encourage North Korea to come back to the table for denuclearization talks?
I would hope so. And I think a lot of people, including the State Department, is hoping that the North Koreans will take this as a good sign and respond in kind. But the fact of the matter is North Koreans have not made any demands of relaxing sanctions on humanitarian assistance in particular. If we've heard any messages through third-party channels or through other government officials from other countries, namely one is South Korea, is that they would like a broad loosening of sanctions on many fronts, not just on humanitarian assistance. And so I'm not hopeful that they're going to respond, but again, it is meaningful to some extent, and I think it's a meaningful gesture on part of the United States to show North Korea that they're willing and ready to make the necessary concessions to get the North Koreans to the bargaining table, and that they also want to take a moral high ground on these kinds of issues, and they don't want to be unreasonable on these humanitarian issues as well.
Some on the other side might argue that this review of the travel ban and the policy on humanitarian assistance is Washington softening its stance on sanctions. Would that be going too far?
Yeah, I think so, because if you listen to Steve Biegun's announcement, he's very clear that this applies only to American organizations and NGOs. So what about other NGOs and other governmental organizations, perhaps? We certainly have a lot in South Korea. It seems to me that this review does not apply to these other cases. And so again, it's limited in scope, but nonetheless, and it means something. It's a token gesture, but again, I wouldn't read too far into it to say that the U.S. is willing to go another extra mile on this. So how the North Koreans respond in the coming days, I think, will be critical in seeing whether or not we're going to get any progress and the Americans willing to give more to get the North Koreans to do more on their side on denuclearization.
Before we move on from this, I also wanted to ask, the timing of Biegun's announcement, it was a little bit surprising because he arrived in Seoul, landed at the airport, and he gave this prepared statement. And surely this is a matter that could have been announced by the State Department in Washington or in Washington. Why was it Biegun who decided to announce here in Seoul?
Well, first of all, Steve Biegun is the point person for negotiating with North Koreans, which means that this was a message to the North Koreans that the U.S. is taking moral high ground on this issue and that they're willing and ready, stand ready for talks if Pyongyang is interested. So I think it's a very symbolic gesture, and it's coming from the person who's supposed to be engaging with the North Koreans, and it seems that he has no other channel, so he's using the channel that's available to him to convey this message. That's the first thing. The second thing is that he's making this announcement in Seoul, so this is not only a message for North Koreans, but it's also a message for South Korea too. There's a narrative here, contrary narrative, that suggests that the Americans are not bargaining in good faith. And I think to some extent he wants to send a message to the South Korean allies that the U.S. is trying to be reasonable on these kinds of issues, and it wants to be a good faith participant in these talks, and that it's not going to be always about throwing down the hammer on the North Koreans with additional sanctions. That U.S. stands willing and ready to make concessions where it is reasonable to do so.
You've mentioned there that Biegun doesn't have any other channels to communicate with North Korea. It's quite interesting because he is the point man for North Korea, for Washington, but he's yet to meet North Korean officials and have meaningful sit-down conversations with them. What's interesting today, though, as well, there were reports that came out that Biegun went to the Inter-Korean border today, to the DMZ, to take a tour of Panmunjeom, the Inter-Korean border village. That raises the question of why he was there. I mean, they say he was there to tour the site and to see with his own eyes this important location. But do you think he might have tried to maybe hold some sort of communication with the North there?
Maybe. If he tried and he failed, then he wouldn't want to announce it. If he did hold a meeting, then he would probably would like to announce that the talks are back on track and that U.S. is working diligently in order to move forward with this process. But clearly, I doubt that any level of meetings or discussions happened with the North Koreans. I mean, the State Department's position right now is that they are waiting for Pyongyang to get back to them on when the next round of talks is going to be. So, and in the meantime, Steve Biegun is out here on a working group meeting with the South Koreans to try to figure out what more can be done to try to get the North Koreans to come back to the bargaining table.
And let's move on to that meeting as well. So Stephen Biegun will be meeting his counterpart Lee Do-hun today and tomorrow, and they will be holding the second working group meeting as well. What do you think is on the table that they're going to be discussing, and what are they trying to get out of these meetings?
So one of the one obvious item on the agenda probably is the South Korean demands demands for inter-Korean cooperation. So South Korea would like to consult with the United States on these issues and to get the U.S. to work together with the Blue House to push forward in a meaningful way on the inter-Korean cooperation. So that's one issue. So they're probably exploring different ways to allow for this process to happen. And U.S. at the same time would like to coordinate with the South Korean counterparts and on keeping sanctions, meaningful sanctions in place, and to have that be enforced as it should be. At the same time, they want to talk about some of the diplomatic efforts that both sides could undertake to try to get Pyongyang to come back to the bargaining table, not later, next year, but sooner the better, earlier part of next year. So I think all of these issues are things that the working group is working on. But it also, having these meetings show both sides, both the United States and South Korea, that the critical stakeholders are working very, very hard and diligently on these issues, that it's not the United States and South Korea that's holding this process back, that they're doing everything they can to try to move forward with the talks. So again, and from a public diplomacy standpoint, I think it sends a really good message. From a policy standpoint, in terms of the content of those discussions, there are a lot of issues that can be discussed at this point until the North Koreans decide to come back to the bargaining table and engage.
Well, we'll have to see what comes out of those talks later this week. And that's we're out of time, so thank you for coming in as always and sharing us your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our programme. I'll be back tomorrow with more analysis of the day's top issues. Thank you for watching and hope you can join us again next time. Goodbye.
As a well-known staple